Hey folks, thank you for joining me today. We're taking a look at Romans chapter 10 and verse 14 through chapter 11 and verse 12. And again, I'm grateful for your presence and for your interest in Romans. Today, we want to begin by what we do usually, taking a bird's eye view of this particular context. Let's note the larger context of Romans chapters 9 through 11. Here, Paul is dealing with questions regarding the Jewish nation, isn't he? And more specifically, he's responding to the Jewish failure to accept Jesus as the Messiah. I think he's really trying to defend God here. I can hear some Jews saying, well, it's God's fault that we rejected Jesus. No, it's not God's fault, Paul says. So Paul is apologizing, sort of. He's giving his apology, that is, his apology for God. He's defending God. Anyway, that's the context. He's dealing with Jewish questions that they might be raising due to their failure to accept Jesus. Now, let's take a look at verses 14 through 17. I love this passage, don't you? But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all have obeyed the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So, faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. Now, that's a beautiful passage that surely encourages us to send out people with the gospel message. I mean, how are people going to believe and obey and be saved if they never hear? And how are they going to hear if no one is sent to proclaim them? But what Paul is talking about here is, well, what is he doing in this text? He's saying that the preaching of the gospel is impossible without the divine commission. A divine commission. God had to send people to proclaim that message. A herald can have nothing to say unless it be given to him. And God sent the proclaimers of the gospel, and thank God that he did. So, Paul is saying that the Jewish nation should have accepted the announcement of these God-sent proclaimers. Again, he's trying to prove that the gospel message was sent by God himself. It's due to the divine commission. And he'll say in the following verses that indeed it's their personal responsibility that they didn't accept the message. That's verses 16, 17, and 18. Have they not heard? Well, yes, they've heard. Did they not understand? Well, yes, they understood. Paul is setting forth the idea here in these verses of personal responsibility. Israel heard, Israel understood, and it's they who just refused to believe and obey. And what Paul is saying for us here too is that unsaved people have no one to blame but themselves. That's what Paul is saying. It's not God's fault or failure that people do not accept the gospel. Each one of us is personally responsible for accepting the gospel, for believing it, and for obeying it. Well, Paul says, chapter 11, verse 1, has God rejected his people? Oh no, he hasn't rejected his people, and he is exhibit A. He says, I myself have been accepted by God. So God hasn't rejected individual Jews. He may have rejected the Jewish nation, but he's not rejected individual Jews who will believe the message of the gospel. And then he gives the illustration of Elijah. And don't you like that illustration? God has always had a remnant. He's always kept a remnant of people who were loyal to him. In Elijah's day, there were 7,000 people who refused to bow the knee to Baal. That's encouraging to us that we are not alone in our service and in our loyalty to God. But of course, the point that Paul is trying to make here is that God has not refused the Jewish nation. He has not rejected them. He has always kept a remnant for himself. Chapter 11 and verse 5. Now, Paul's going to add here that this remnant that God is keeping for himself is saved by grace. Once again, he returns to that great theme in this gospel, in this letter. He's still trying to convince the Jews that they cannot be saved by their works or by obeying the law. They must be saved by God's grace. It must be received from them, by them as a gift of God. He's saying here that no amount of works can blot out sins already committed. Forgiveness is a matter of grace, and there is no grace when a person merits salvation. That's verse 6. All right. What's interesting to me about this passage, well, there's so much, but the lengths to which Paul is willing to go to defend God and his actions, the lengths that he's willing to go to convince the Jews that they need to turn to God and believe the gospel. And isn't he very rational in his approach as he goes back to Scripture to prove his point and to make his argument, to build his case? Paul cares for God. Paul cares for the gospel of God's grace. And Paul cares for the people who have not yet accepted the message of salvation. There's some lessons there for us. All right. I'll see you next time.